Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. We are so pleased to have you join us today as we try to tackle the question, how can businesses secure a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient future for the food sector? My name is Morgan Gillespie. I'm the Executive Director of the Food and Land Use Coalition, and I will be moderating today's session. Now, to examine this very important issue, we are lucky to be joined by a diverse set of experts. We have Alex Androli, who's an associate at Systemic. We have Ameline Falus, who's the Senior Director, Agriculture and Food, and is also a member of WBCSD's Extended Leadership Group, WBCSD, of course, being the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We have Owen Bethel joining us from Nestle, where he's the Environmental Impact Lead for Global Public Affairs, and Malindi Sibomana, who is the Chief Agriculture Officer of the One Acre Fund Rwanda. And last but certainly not least, we have Luc Pritchard, who's the Deputy Director for Nature-Based Solutions at the We Mean Business Coalition. So a huge, fantastic panel for you. Now, what is the next hour and a bit going to look like? Well, first, we're going to hear from Alex, and he will spotlight some of the recent research from Follow and Partners before moving on to our panelists who will share their thoughts. Hopefully we'll have a robust discussion about some of the findings of this new research. And we will, of course, be saving some time for a Q&A with our speakers at the end of our session today. You should all see on your screen the live Q&A function, so please use it to submit questions throughout the event. We'll be scanning through those and selecting a few of them to pose to our panelists. Now, before we dive into today's discussion, I want to take maybe 5 minutes to set the scene, to really look at the broad context of food systems transformation, to understand why is it urgent that we transform our food and land use systems, and why the business role is so important. Now, if you are in the space, which I'm sure many of you are, it is hopefully clear that today's food and land use systems aren't really serving their purpose of feeding the world in a way that is sustainable, that is equitable, and that's nutritious. Now, just earlier this year, just last month, I think, the Food Systems Economic Commission released new research, and they found that the costs of the food system are mortgaging our future. They are undermining future productive potential by well over $10 trillion a year. Yes, I said trillion. The impacts of our food system are already problematic, and some might say devastating. And if they're to continue, we will face a $4 trillion cost increase in damage to people and planet per year by 2050. And that $4 trillion breaks down into $3 trillion of health costs to people, largely from obesity, from pollution, from pesticide exposure, and the further $1 trillion in environmental costs. Now, if those economic costs weren't bad enough, food and land use systems are also contributing to climate change. They're the largest driver of ecosystem conversion and biodiversity loss. They account for 70% of freshwater withdrawals globally. And taking all that we do from the environment, we are still left with more than 700 million people facing hunger. This was the number that faced hunger regularly throughout 2022. And of course, we expect global demand for food to grow in response to growing population, and that's estimated to increase by at least 35% by 2050. So we need more food, we need to protect and regenerate the environment, and we need to figure out how to mitigate these trillions of dollars of costs of our current food system. So against this backdrop, we know that transforming food systems is central to our economic, our environmental, and our social challenges. And all of the stakeholders need to co-create solutions, and that includes the private sector. Now, I said this at the start, but FOLU, We Mean Business, and WBCSD just published a new report series. It's called The Future Fit Food and Agriculture, and it highlights the need for food and ag companies to rapidly adapt to changing sustainability regulation, and it explores the costs and benefits of mitigating the largest portion of food sector emissions. Now, what did we find? The analysis shows that investments of $205 billion per year every year between 2025 and 2030 could mitigate nearly half of global food systems emissions, as well as unlocking many other benefits. Now, if you do the quick maths, it's about $1 trillion. You might be thinking, $1 trillion. This report also found that that was less than 2% of food sector revenues. Now, policymakers we know are already using voluntary standards and frameworks as the basis for mandatory regulation. And for this reason, we believe companies should leverage existing and emerging voluntary standards as frameworks so that they stay ahead of the game, right? It can help to minimize transition risk. But a critical challenge, and something that I hope we discuss today, is that the costs of the transition are unequitably distributed across the value chain. And our research confirms that these costs tend to land most heavily on farmers. Overcoming this inequity requires companies to fundamentally reassess how they are partnering with actors in the value chain, particularly farmers. And we think they also need to engage with policymakers to help to accelerate the action necessary. Now that's all from me. I'm going to hand over now to Alex, who is one of the key authors of this report series, and he's going to unpack the key findings for all of us before we open up the floor to our panelists for a discussion. Alex, over to you.
Thank you very much, Morgan, and thank you for setting out the state of play in such a compelling and comprehensive way. I have the opportunity now to take you all through some of the detail behind our reports and some of the figures behind the headline items that Morgan's just outlined. As she said, food systems currently are driving environmental degradation, but that doesn't have to be the case. Today, we estimate that food system emissions account for 18 to 20 gigatons of CO2 equivalent annually, which is approximately a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. And we expect that to grow, as you see here on this graph and the figure on the left, to 21 gigatons by 2030. And why is this important, and why have we written this for food and agriculture businesses specifically? Well, we think that 75% of these emissions we find sits within company value chains and inside their kind of formal economy. Of that 16 gigatons, we think that 10 gigatons, about 60%, come from agricultural emissions and land use change. So really about how we produce food and the impact we have on the environment on farms. That means that agriculture and land use change within company value chains account for approximately half of global food system emissions. While this is a significant figure, it's also quite hard to tackle because for many companies, this sits outside of their scope 1 and 2 emissions and actually in their scope 3. Next slide, please, Clara. Thank you. It's critical that companies address these scope 3 emissions. And so on this graph here, you see what we think is a typical kind of scope 1, 2, and 3 emission spectrum for a large multinational food company. And we think about 90%, if not more, of emissions for such a company sit within their scope 3, i.e. indirect value chain emissions, which are outside their kind of direct control. The majority of these, you can see on the far right, the 55 to 75% bar, are from purchased ingredients and products, and these are the agricultural production and land use change emissions that we saw in the graph before. It's critical that companies tackle these emissions. As report 1 outlines in this series, to tackling these scope 3 emissions is important to both meet climate and nature targets, but it's also critical to prepare for upcoming legislation. And to meet net zero globally, it's essential that we mitigate these emissions. Next slide, please, Clara. As Morgan mentioned, we find that investment of up to $205 billion per year from the food sector between 2025 and 2030 could achieve up to 9 gigatons of mitigation by 2030. That's a huge number and an incredible opportunity for the food sector to grab hold of. We've assessed approximately 70 solutions to mitigate emissions and broken them down, as you see across the top of this figure, into 4 buckets. no regret solutions, cost of monitored and verifiable traceability, further cost for mitigation action, and investments in new and growing markets. And across the left, we've broken them down as to where these kind of mitigation outcomes happen, be it nature protection, i.e., protecting forests and peatlands from degradation, on-farm solutions, i.e., mitigating emissions, reducing emissions or increasing sequestration on farms, and demand-side solutions, so managing the demand for agricultural commodities through either dietary shifts or reducing food loss and waste. Across the top then, and looking into these solutions, the no regret solutions, think here efficiency gains and improving yields without increasing cost. So for some of these, we are looking at improved rice cultivation and reducing water use, or reducing nutrient management and reducing synthetic fertilizer application whilst maintaining yields. Costs of monitored and verifiable traceability to guarantee deforestation within deforestation-free supply chains. That's investing in technologies that increase kind of visibility across the supply chains and accountability across supply chains. Further costs for mitigation outcomes. We find that there are, as you can see, an $85 billion bucket or group of solutions on farm and 20 billion in demand side management that are solutions that achieve mitigation outcomes but do come at a price. And some of these, to give an example, are anaerobic digesters in livestock or feed additives for livestock feed. They are proven to achieve a mitigation outcome but do come at additional cost. And the last bucket there is investments in new and growing markets, something that could be an incredible opportunity for the sector. And here, not only we've looked at alternative proteins, but also on the demand side solutions, but also there are applicable solutions across the value chain. Next slide, please. As Morgan mentioned, this $205 billion number, while large, we do think it's manageable. It represents less than 2% of the food sector's projected annual revenues. We've talked about or mentioned that a fifth of the investment is also in, or a fifth of the cost is investment in new and growing markets. Breaking those down on the right, you can see that in nature protection, we're looking at wild forest and non-timber forest products for forest frontier communities. So investing in nature positive businesses that protect forests and keep forests and peatlands intact. For on-farm solutions, we've looked at the growth of agroforestry and how these kind of new and diversified income streams will generate farmer revenues, but also increase sequestration on farmland. And in demand side solutions, we've looked at alternative proteins and how they can contribute to the dietary shift. Not only do these solutions generate extra revenues, but there are savings to be gained. And we looked at the no regret solutions before, and that amounts to an additional $30 billion per year. And lastly, these solutions often also deliver co-benefits. And when we're looking at adaptation to climate and delivering on other outcomes, not just carbon mitigation, these solutions are a real kind of win-win across multiple metrics. Think temperature regulation, water regulation on farms, and protecting nature within value chains. So these solutions deliver across multiple metrics. Next slide, please. But as Morgan mentioned, one of the challenges that has to be faced is how to overcome the inequitable distribution of costs and risks. At the moment, farmers are often being asked to pay for this mitigation. And we found in our analysis that actually doing so could lead to insolvency. In this example here, we've compared a large Brazilian beef farm with a regional meat trader and a large multinational food company, and found that to achieve 30% mitigation, i.e. in line with forest, land and agriculture targets from SBTi, to achieve 30% mitigation, it would cost a Brazilian beef farm 17% of their revenues, whereas for a regional meat trader or a large multinational food company, 3% and less than 1% of their revenues, respectively. For a beef farmer, these prohibitively high costs could lead to insolvency and will really hamper any of these solutions getting to scale. And so it's incumbent upon the rest of the value chain, the wider value chain, working together to come up with solutions and manage the costs of the transitions in a way that really incentivizes farmers to adopt them and rewards them for doing so. And we've seen examples of this happen before, and they are being picked up widely, but it needs to be accelerated. And when we're talking about reasons why we're not seeing enough action happen, we find this as one of the key barriers to change. Next slide, please. So how can food and agriculture companies work to overcome these challenges? So as report 1 outlines of the series, the first step is to develop detailed, credible, and costed sustainability strategies. There are plenty of voluntary standards and frameworks out there at the moment to help companies on this journey. And we are seeing that these standards are being adopted by policymakers, and so a real drive to change. This next step, as we mentioned, is to collaborate directly with farmers to alleviate many of these costs and risks. And the last step is to develop really clear policy asks for policymakers. And the reports outline a number of these, including harmonizing standards, implementing payments for ecosystem services, and aligning public procurement policies with healthy and sustainable food. That's my last slide. I'll hand back to you, Morgan. Thank you very much, and I look forward to this discussion.
Thanks so much, Alex. Thank you for that comprehensive review of some of those key findings. And I think what I love sometimes about reports is like some of the things we've all been saying for a really long time, i.e. the cost is unequitably distributed, hits harder when we actually have the data, the analytics, and the research to back it up. Okay, we're going to move over now to our panelists. And to kick us off, I want to do a very quick round robin. So each panelist, 2 minutes each. I want to know, what is your perspective as to how businesses can help to secure a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient future for the food sector? So Ameline, I'm going to come to you first, then Owen, Melindy, and then Luke. 2 minutes, Ameline.
Sure. Thank you so much, Morgan and Alex, for bringing all of these numbers to our mind. So to your question, first, I want to highlight the fact that indeed the $205 billion is daunting, but actually when you put it in the terms of 2% of the sector's average annual revenue, it's really not so much. So it's a question of really how do we redirect some of the money that is there in order to better reflect what we call the externalities and in fact the true value of food, as we like to call it. And I know we have some colleagues in the call today that I've seen that are big defenders of the true value of food concept. I want to answer your question and say, for me, there are 2 top pieces that the companies need to find ways to better address. One is putting farmers at the center of the transition and access to finance for that transition. So we've heard about it all the time. We've heard about the issue of securing a future for farmers, and yet we haven't nailed that. If you look at the World Benchmarking Alliance latest numbers last year, we see that encouragingly, 27% of companies support farmers' income stability through procurement and pricing practices. However, less than 4% of companies identify living income benchmarks or calculate living income gaps. So that's really a very first step, is to start measuring and identifying interventions that support farmers. This is critical, of course, because as you highlighted, farmers are the ones that have the least possibility to pay for the transition, and yet they carry most of the implementation risks and they face the highest costs. So you've mentioned it, as an example. It takes up to 17%, so 17% of the revenues for the transition for, let's say, a large-scale beef farm in Brazil. And that's just huge, and it's just not feasible for them. So my second point is to say we need to secure, and that wasn't part of the 3 points that Alex talked about. He talked about clearer policy asks, and often what we like to say in the BBCSD is we also need to really have clear asks in terms of finance, and we need to define clear solutions. We need to find ways to go through public and private sources and other supporting solutions for farmers, such as supplying low or no interest working capital loans to farmers, securing offtake agreements to guarantee demand for sustainable products, and offering premium prices, etc. So that's really an area that I'd love to develop a bit more later, but I want to respect the 2 minutes, so maybe that's something we can address in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Ameline. I love that. I'm going to summarize it as farmers and finance, right? Two really critical points of takeaways. Oh, and coming to you next, 2 minutes on a sustainable, equitable, and resilient future for food.
Sure, thank you, and thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today. I think this is a really timely report and very welcome. It draws attention to a topic which we've talked about quite a lot at Nestle, actually, which is how do we fund this transition? How do we ensure that there's enough money going to the front line, to the farmers who need it, to implement the projects that we then need to see to help meet our sustainability objectives? And I'm pleased to say that we are one of the companies that moved on this quite early. We set out a time-bound roadmap, which included funding back in 2020, including funding going to regenerative agriculture and thereby going into farmer projects and to farmers themselves. So I think, the number one thing that companies should be doing is thinking about how can they allocate sufficient funding to the front line, to the people who actually implement the projects as part of their net zero plans, as part of their transition plans as companies. And I think as we see the implementation of CSRD coming in over the next couple of years, there's going to be a lot more movement in that regard, because not only do you need to make a commitment, you need to show how you're going to achieve that commitment, and you can't do that without sufficient capital allocation and funding going into the system. So I think, properly recognizing the cost and declaring that cost publicly is a really important action for companies to take. And I think the other one is around what kind of additional service or value add can you offer to the system. So from a Nestle perspective, we don't actually own land. We are not farmers, so we don't do that bit. But what we do is we provide support, and we have a network of around 700 agronomists who go out around the world providing extension services to farmers. And we're also able to work with our suppliers and to use our purchasing power to encourage our suppliers to move in the right direction to support the transition. So I think it's about finding a sweet spot which doesn't go too far beyond your core competencies, because we're not farmers, we're manufacturers, but we are also a company that purchases things, and we have a lot of standards and a lot of commitments to live up to. So if you can harness that has a transformational effect and can lead to greater financial flows and impact. So two things: recognize that this thing's going to cost money and allocate that money. And secondly, think about where else you can add value through the expertise you have in your company. Thanks.
Thanks, Owen. Now, Melindy, coming to you next. And for folks on the line who might not know, One Acre Fund, right? One Acre Fund is a social enterprise that supplies smallholder farmers in East Africa with asset-based financing and agriculture training services to reduce hunger and poverty. So we've heard the perspective of the big business. I would love your perspective in 2 minutes on this.
Thanks, Morgan. And of course, I want to thank the guys who are presenting the report. Really eye-opening stuff. I think on our side, and I hope you can hear me well, there's a bit of an echo in the background, just let me know. So the main issue that I think here, and I like what my colleague mentioned about transition, is how do we maintain our proximity to the production base, and of course for different levels of production. So we've got large scale commercial farmers, and we've got of course differing scales of production. But I think one of the biggest challenges we find in transition is there's lack of that advisory extension support to help the farmers move from one level to the next level. So I think one of the ways that I think we could support here is how do we ensure that that proximity to farmers is not lost? And then how do we continuously improve on that? Because it's one thing to deliver technology or a practice to farmers, but then they will also give you feedback. And how do you continue improving on that part? So I think the first part I would say is proximity to your production base and making sure that you can walk the journey with the farmers and provide that advisory at every step of the way. And of course, as things adjust, you can also adjust your level of extension with the farmers. The next thing that I would also say is, how do we ensure there are strong information loops between farmers and markets? In our work with farmers in East Africa, working on the market linkages side, we find that there's a big disconnect, whereby the quality that's required from the markets, farmers are not able to meet that, or farmers are trying to grow into that, but the markets are not yet ready to risk or to invest at that level with the farmers. So I think there needs to be that information loop connecting farmers to the businesses, and then of course have that consistent level of markets available for the farmers. I like the colleague from Nestle, what he was mentioning there about investing in agronomists, but then also investing in understanding what is the condition of the farmers that we're purchasing the produce from, and how can we meet the farmers where they are, and as you said, transition with them into areas of progress for the farmers. So those main two things. One is how do you support production through better extension and continuously improving on that? And then the second one is how do you make sure that the information flows between farmers and markets and back to farmers is strong and it's always connected? Yeah.
Thank you for that. Very clear. Luke, last but not least, 2 minutes, please, on your perspective on how businesses can help to secure sustainable, equitable, and resilient future.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. And first, just huge congratulations to you and the entire FOLU team for getting this report out there. I think it was more than 2 years ago where we first started talking about this need together with colleagues at WBCSD and Systemic to really set the goal, the goalposts and kind of the roadmap for how much and where we needed private finance to be mobilized to support this transition. And so it's great to have this out there in such an analytically robust way. So a lot of gratitude from our side to the work from the FOLU Coalition. You know, when I was reading these reports, and in terms of recommendations, something that came front of mind to me was actually a piece that was written by Barry Perkin, who's the Chief Procurement Officer at Mars, many years ago, calling on the end to the commodity era. And I actually think that that is going to be the key to getting investments where they're needed. We need to get beyond this commodity-centric paradigm that I think our food system has really become entrenched in. And the reality is, over hundreds of years, our food system has evolved to try and place equivalent value, a uniform value on what comes off of the farm, regardless of what the environmental and social impact that went into producing it was. So that's what a commodity is, right? A ton of cocoa from the Ivory Coast is a ton of cocoa from the Ivory Coast. A very expensive ton right now, I might add. And I think that that's a system that's been really successful in driving some operational efficiencies, economic efficiencies, and especially in some of these complex international supply chains. But I think it's also come at the expense of farmers. So I think what we've seen is this mindset has stymied investments in farmers themselves by reinforcing the notion that the farmers, the way they steward the land, the way they cultivate crops, that they're interchangeable, they're of little consequences. So why would I, as a company, invest in a farmer in Iowa, where I'm buying corn from today, if I know next year I'm going to be buying from a different farmer in Kansas? So we've really entrenched this kind of short-term transactional mindset with farmers that has resulted in chronic underinvestment in the way that our food's grown. And I think my big takeaway from this report is that incumbent system that we're in is not going to get the investments where they're needed. So we know more than 60% of the solutions lie in the hands of farmers, more than that if you include deforestation. Offtake agreements aren't going to get those investments where they're needed. This is additional money that we need to get up into the hands of farmers. We know that implementing these solutions will have enormous costs and enormous risks, and everyone along the supply chain has a responsibility to de-risk. And so what does the post-commodity era look like for me? I think it's transitioning to a system where we're placing value not just on what comes off of the farm, but placing value on what happens on the farm. It's changing that fundamental relationship with farmers. So we're not just having these one-off transactional experiences, but we're really putting the farmers at the center of the system as indispensable long-term partners, vital for establishing these dependable, resilient supply chains in the face of climate change. And I think the good news, we heard from Owen, Nestle's going down this pathway. We've had big announcements from other consumer goods companies like Danone, Pepsi, retailers like Walmart. That transition is well underway, but if we make the same amount of progress we made over the last 6 years and the next 6 years, we're not going to get there fast enough. So we really need to accelerate this move towards a post-commodity era, I would argue, and that'll be key to getting the investments where they're needed and de-risking this transition for farmers.
Thanks, Luke. I love that post-commodity era. I feel like that's going to be the catchphrase of this webinar. We have 30 minutes now, guys, listening online for a panel discussion. We have encouraged our panelists to jump in, raise their hands. We're going to try to cover what businesses are doing, what policymakers are doing, the protests that we've seen from farmers. So hopefully it'll be a wide-ranging and interesting conversation. And I'm going to come back to you, Ameline, because WBCSD represents effectively the voice of hundreds of businesses. We've heard from you and others from the World Benchmarking Alliance and Luke saying there's some progress being made. But even when we see that, there's like, we can count the good companies, quote unquote, good companies, like what, on one hand, on two hands? So you tell us, what are leading businesses doing in this space? Where do they need to focus more of their effort? Where do we need to see more collective effort?
Yeah, it's quite a good question. Thank you, Morgan. It's funny to hear that there is the good and the bad companies. I think actually there is, the task is so huge that a lot of companies are making efforts to progress, but actually there is so many things to address that often a company is able to, let's say, progress a lot on, for instance, regenerative agriculture, but it doesn't mean that they manage to necessarily address all of the parts of it. So, we in the WBCSD, we identify 3 imperatives, which are climate, nature, and equity. And we believe that none of those will be tackled without the other. But it's a difficult one. So I shared before the numbers around livelihoods, farmer livelihoods. There is progress. Some companies are making very impressive commitments and progress around that, but we come from very, very far, and the smallholder farmers are still the poorest in the world. So the gap is huge. And unless we find ways, as I said before, to finance and help the farmers get in a better position, then it would be impossible for them to tackle, the transformation we're asking in terms of moving towards regenerative farming systems, for instance. But I'll give you a few examples. If you look again at the World Benchmarking Alliance, I've talked about it before because they issue a benchmark every 2 years of the 350 biggest companies across sectors, but in food and agriculture as well. And they really look at progress against environmental, social, and economic and governance parameters. And so we can see that there is quite some progress on greenhouse gas emissions and nature preservation, yet, not enough. As Luke was saying, it's not the speed that we need. But in fact, a lot of the companies still do not count Scope 3 emissions in fact, the progress that they're making. And many of them are not able yet to tackle farmer livelihoods, as I mentioned. Still, there are some really inspiring examples that I'd like to share. And so I'll share one. Of course, I'll share one from Nestlé, given that Owen is here. It's the Net Zero Initiative, NZI. Into which Nestlé invested, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Owen, invested more than 10 million USD to demonstrate the economic viability for dairy businesses of reaching net zero emissions by finding the right blend of regenerative practices, technologies, and incentives. We have another example of another member of the BCSD, OCP, which is based in Morocco, who's developed a partnership with Brazilian agricultural group Bioline, by Envivo, and agri-tech company AgroRobotica, which aims to use income from carbon credit generation to help finance the transition gap facing many producers, while collaborating with technology providers, which is really an important piece that we need to tackle as well, to help lower the costs of soil analysis in order to support the scalability of decarbonization programs in agriculture. There are many, many other examples. I think I often feel bad to just talk about some examples because we know that the idea behind that is really scaling up. But one of the things that we've launched at COP28 together with the climate champions, the COP28 presidency, and also BCG, is an action agenda on regenerative landscapes, which actually maps and shows to the world which are the efforts going on right now on regenerative agriculture. There is a lot in there already, a lot of investments already, over 2 billion, millions of farmers that are involved in those partnerships. And really the aim of that project is to show what is already happening. And again, to try and do 2 things. It's to really draw the attention of the policymakers and the financiers as to the movement that has started, and really find ways to secure more funding for that transition that is needed. So I'll stop here, but I'm open to questions and comments in the chat, of course.
Well, that's great, Emmeline. And I hear you, right? It's not like there's good companies and bad companies. I do know, however, that not all companies engage. Not all companies have set SBTIs. Not all companies report in terms of environmental reporting. I tend to lump them in the quote unquote bad camp. But oh, and I want to come to you next. You know, we want to hear what Nestle is doing. I don't want 2 minutes on all the good stuff. I also want to know, where are you facing challenges? What are you finding really, really hard? How are you dealing with your scope 3 emissions? And how are you considering the costs and investment needed internally? And I'd specifically push that to say, how do you get business cases signed off from this? Because we know RI is difficult, right? We know that that's really challenging, particularly in the ag space. How does it work for you?
Yeah, sure. So there are definitely good things happening and challenges as well. So, you know, just to start off with the program itself, we are focused on a 20% absolute reduction in our emissions by 2025, so the end of next year. That's pretty soon, and then a 50% absolute reduction by 2030, end of 2030. So you can obviously see that there's going to need to be a significant ramp up between 25 and 30 for that objective to be met. So what we're doing now is we're trying to set the foundations for success. So we're looking at things like improving traceability, certification, ensuring no deforestation in our key supply chains, looking at other sort of low-hanging fruit, if you want to call it that, in terms of moving to different types of packaging materials and more efficient supply chains, and the use of renewable electricity in our facilities. So all of that helps, but it's really on the agricultural side where the big impact is going to be, of course. So we have many pilot projects underway around the world in different types of agricultural system, testing what is going to work and what we can then look to scale. And that includes things like agroforestry in cocoa and coffee, which is actually proving to be very successful. Those are already relatively low emissions intensity products anyway, commodities anyway. But then if you introduce agroforestry, you can deliver a carbon benefit, a biodiversity benefit as well, potentially, and a farmer income benefit. So, you know, it's not just about the carbon. We need to look at this holistically, and our projects are designed to do that from the get-go. I think if you look at dairy, that's our single biggest source of emissions. And Emmeline mentioned one of the initiatives that we've invested in. So moving beyond just our own sort of sphere of influence, looking at a cross-industry potential solution to some of those challenges, that's really important for us. And I think dairy is going to be a really massive part of the program going forwards, because it's hard to abate, let's face it. But there are solutions that are in the works. There are things we can do now, such as more efficient management of the farm, such as reusing manure. You know, not something we talk about maybe every day, manure, but it's actually a big resource and can be for farmers, and providing advice on how to kind of evolve the business model so that it's better for them, and it's better in terms of the emissions footprint. And that means that they can continue to provide us with what we need, and we can continue to report that success in the future. So, you know, it's challenging, but I think there are good signs emerging, and there's going to be more collaboration on the horizon to try and do more over the next 5 to 6 years.
Perfect. Thanks, Owen. Melinda, I'm going to come to you next, because Owen just kind of closed by saying, you know, these interventions that they're making are better for the farmers. And so I'd love to understand from your perspective, what do you think are some of the key drivers of the inequities in the system today? And what are some of the key things that need to happen to address these challenges? You know, is it going to be enough if all the big MNCs in the world sort of work more collaboratively with farmers? Like, is that enough? What more or not?
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. And maybe I'll refer to something that Luke had mentioned earlier about where we're placing the value. And I think it's really about placing the value on relationships with the farmers. And again, all levels of farmers, so that you can understand where the farmers are coming from. I think one of the biggest drivers, or I can even say barriers to entry for farmers, is lack of access to markets or higher value markets. And it's really because of sometimes the requirements. And the requirements are coming from a good place. We're talking about certifications, for example. We understand what the value of the certification is. But if you think about a farmer, a smallholder farmer, or a farmer with limited means trying to implement some of these practices, it's sometimes a barrier of entry. And how then do we look at that barrier of entry and say, okay, how can we incentivize farmers to come from point A to point B? And this is what I meant earlier by walking the journey with the farmer. So what I would say is sometimes there's a limited access to market just because of the requirements of that particular market. So even if you're growing coffee or cocoa, or mangoes or something, if the requirements are so prohibitive already because of lack of access to finance as well, or even just the ability of the farmer to implement at their scale, you can see how it sort of is a detriment to farmers. So one of the things that we've been thinking of at One Acre Fund is how do we start linking farmers to markets? And then when we're talking to the market, try and customize some of these requirements for the farmers and say, okay, we can get the farmers from point A to point B, but it will take us a while. And what incentives can we give these farmers in that time? So I think in terms of what is needed, of course, we're talking about finance, we're talking about even incentivizing. If you talk about agroforestry, keeping the trees on the field itself. So if I plant some trees around my plantation, after a while I might cut them down if I don't have any incentive for keeping these trees there. So we have to start thinking about how do we incentivize this level of transition from point A to point B. And then also when we start thinking of those certifications, and this is why I'm talking about placing the value on the relationship with farmers, is when we talk to the farmers, we also get that feedback from the farmer on what is possible now, what is possible in the future, and then to close that gap between now and the future, what is it that we can do collaboratively, to your words, Morgan, to get the farmer from that level to the next. Yeah.
Perfect. You've raised like a really interesting question. And Luke, I'm going to come to you next, because in the first report in the series, the Future Fit report, we talk a lot about regulation. And Melinda just spoke to, access to market through the lens of certification, which is not yet regulated, but we know that there's going to be regulation coming from the EU that may pose challenges for farmers, particularly smallholder farmers, to access these markets. So Luke, my question to you is, what do policymakers need to do to accelerate this transition for business and or for farmers? And are there any good examples of where this is already happening?
Yeah, I think this is a great, really prudent question. I think, we talked about the 205 billion that we need from the private sector, but we also need to recognize that we already have somewhere between 400, 550 billion in environmentally harmful agricultural subsidies every year. And so that needs to be a huge part of the solution. If we don't align how those subsidies are flowing, it isn't going to make much of a dent what the private sector does. And so we need to start tackling that head on, but we also need to be politically prudent and cognizant about what those subsidies are. And so for farmers around the world, those are subsidies that keep the lights on, that keep the farm running, that really make the business model work. And they're understandably going to get very nervous when you start talking about subsidy reform. And so I think, one example here in the United States is the Inflation Reduction Act. And what we had accompanying the Inflation Reduction Act was $20 billion in new spending on farmers to support their transition to climate smart agriculture. And what we didn't see was farmers protesting on the streets about new funding coming in to support existing and new subsidies that are popular for farmers. And so I think we need to be politically prudent about what this transition looks like, bringing in incentives first, building a broad support base among the agricultural community for those subsidies. But we can't ignore the environmentally harmful side of it either. So we need to get to a point where we start tackling those. But I think if you start building the support among the agricultural base for those positive subsidies, then we can talk about redirecting some of those environmentally harmful subsidies to where you're seeing growing support for those positive incentives. And so I think we just need to be prudent and recognize that the subsidy system out there is a key driver of this change. But it's not about taking money out of farmers' hands. It's about redirecting it so that we have those positive outcomes in what's happening on the farm.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. And I'm curious, I'm going to put Owen on the spot, but I'll come to Ameline first. Because, should businesses be advocating or calling for agricultural subsidy pivots as part of this? Is that the role of business? Would that be helpful to farmers? So Ameline, you don't have to necessarily answer that question, Owen, I'm going to ask you that question, but, at a bigger picture, at a more meta level, what support do businesses need from policymakers to unlock this transition? And are there any examples today where businesses and policymakers are working well together to unlock solutions? Or are they still kind of operating in their own silos?
Yeah, I like the question. I actually wanted to quote, first of all, a representative, maybe I won't say the name, but a representative of the World Bank who at the COP28 in Dubai was actually quote saying that the number is really flabbergasting in a sense that 90% of the subsidies that are going to agriculture today are detrimental to health and or the environment. So it's just, you know, it's huge amount that can just be redirected for the better. So just to stress what Luke was saying. In terms of, absolutely, in terms of advocacy and trying, you know, a lot of the governments are worried to go in a direction if they don't feel that it's economically feasible and if they don't feel that the businesses support them. So we believe in the need for having a common advocacy that, you know, of progressive companies that actually really want a change and that with a common voice actually propose solutions to policymakers. And that's very much what, you know, WBCSD and coalitions like Follow and others are doing. I'll take an example. We have very clearly in WBCSD established a number of key policy asks that we actually communicate a lot about around reforming agricultural subsidies, needing public procurement in alignment with healthy and sustainable diets, needing carbon pricing mechanisms. But also beyond that, what we believe is really important is having dialogues between public and private sector to drive a shared agenda. We saw it with what happened with the protests, the farmer protests recently in Europe, and how much, unfortunately, it has made a number of the green agenda being stopped. And this is probably because there was not enough consultations before. And I actually think that some of the asks from the farmers were misheard. I don't think it was about asking to pose every environmental objective we had. It was about actually making sure that they had enough to live and that there was a better share across the value chain of the value. So, you know, increasingly we've been invited to a number of meetings to actually talk about that and how can we try and have a shared vision across all of the stakeholders. You know, I think often when we talk about sustainable development, we often provide a picture of how dull the future is and say, you have to make this and that change, otherwise we're all going to collapse, which may be true, by the way, but that's not how you inspire people to act. And I think what we've been really lacking is an inspiring vision. You know, I put it in the chat earlier in one of our answers. You know, there is an inspiring future of a regenerative, equitable system that produces nutritious food that is affordable for everyone with the changes that Alex has so eloquently shared. So that's really what we need to show. And thereafter, we need to indeed show how the business, together with the right policy changes and the finance that need to follow, can really ensure that this vision is delivered.
I love that, Amelie, because I agree with you. I think there's not enough optimists in the space and not enough inspiring vision of the future. How can we, you know, creatively articulate what we all want to see as a future that's more equitable and resilient and affordable for all. I'm going to come on to you next for a policy question, but for folks on the line, just a gentle reminder, loads of you have been popping in really excellent questions into the Q&A box. Our panelists have been responding to those questions in real time. So if you haven't checked out the Q&A box, click it open and there's a really rich sort of conversation going on the sidelines of this. Owen, back to you. We've been talking about policymakers. We've been talking about the importance of businesses engaging with policymakers. So I would love to understand from Nestle's perspective, what asks do you have of policymakers, or do you have an example of how you work with policymakers either in a particular region or country that helps you to achieve your net zero objectives, your more resilient, equitable objectives?
Sure. Yeah. Look, I think engagement with policymakers is crucial. Having the right enabling environment is going to help us go from the sort of, you know, project-based approach I talked about before, the 20% reduction by 2025. You know, that we can do, I think, without necessarily having big shifts in external policy. But getting to 50% reduction, getting to net zero, and also creating these other positive outcomes on biodiversity and water resources and livelihoods, etc., it does require a slightly bigger system shift. So that is really important for us. I think it's quite a challenging moment right now, as Emmeline set out, and I think we need to really sort of take a bit of a moment to consider how to create a bottom-up movement of policy change, which isn't about imposing something from, from a big multinational, which is not supported by those working in the supply chain. I think that's the worst possible thing you can really do right now. So I think we're really interested in the idea of dialogue with farmers and producers in terms of supporting a constructive discussion around the future. What does that look like? How do we make that more inclusive, equitable, fair? There's a couple of things going on. There's the strategic dialogue on the future of agriculture with the president of the European Commission happening at the moment, which is a little bit high level, but there are farmers' organisations involved. I think that could be taken forwards in the next Parliament once we see what happens as the outcome of the elections in June. And there are discussions happening in other places too around things like land use, particularly in LATAM, where the Brazilian government now is quite interested in stopping deforestation. We're interested in stopping deforestation. There's a good alignment there. I think a lot of other stakeholders support that view. So, how can we sort of build a consensus around that leads to positive action, including policy, but also private sector action? So policy matters. It's not going to stop us doing what we need to do, but it will certainly enable a scale up and a bigger impact. So we'll continue doing our engagement on that.
Yeah, I mean, and you raise a good point, right? With the new Brazilian government, they have obviously done a big pivot and focused on halting deforestation, but they're also really focusing on ending hunger, right? And they're taking that to the G20. And of course, these two things, sometimes people think, oh, these aren't connected, but how do you solve for hunger? A portion of that is being able to produce food, and how do you produce that food in a way that isn't driving greater deforestation, particularly in the Brazilian context? So these dialogues, bringing the different stakeholders together, bringing the experts that sit on the health and nutrition side with the conservation and deforestation folks together and co-creating a shared vision of the future, I think is really important. And as we have a lot more polarized politics, I'm American, I feel like I can say that from the American perspective, how do we not shut people down, and how do we continue to foster dialogue, I think is so important, and particularly in the world today. Guys, we have 7 minutes left of this panel, and I want to pivot now to a conversation about protests, right? We've been seeing a lot of protests from farmers on sustainability measures in several countries over the last kind of 3 years, really. I would love to hear from you. What's driving this? Melindy, what do you think? Luke, I'm going to come to you next. So what's driving these protests? Melindy.
Yeah, that's a good question, Morgan. And I think we've been fortunate enough not to see too much in the way of protests in our countries of operation. So touch wood, it continues. But I think something that we decided of discussing on transition, working in an extension area for a long time, you do find that sometimes a lot of policies are coming that are quite imposed. You have to change, you have to do this, you have to do this practice, otherwise you won't get a market or something like this. And I think there should be some thought that's given to this transition period and how do we sort of soften the blow. So, for example, if we're talking about regenerative practices, if we start talking about things like minimum tillage, we know that sometimes you get yield penalties. If a farmer was doing conventional tillage, moves to minimum tillage, he gets yield penalties. What is the incentive for the farmer to transition in a situation like this? If you think about like agroforestry, and then you start having now competition on small land area for trees with food crops or commercial crops. So again, how do we soften the blow? So I think maybe there needs to be a bit more effort. I know it's there, so I'm not saying that it's not there at all, but there needs to be effort that's targeted towards thinking about cushioning that move from one practice to another practice, and then continuous improvement, because every time you take a technology out, you deliver it to the end user, there's always some feedback that you're going to get. What do you do with that feedback, and how do you act on it? I think that's going to help us to move past this. Of course, there's always going to be protests, but at least it's going to help it to be more of a dialogue, like you mentioned, between the farmers and the policy implementers on sustainability measures. But just thinking about when there's shocks because of these measures, how is that incentivized for the farmer to actually adopt these measures? So that's what I would say.
Thank you so much for that. I'm conscious of time, but before I kind of open up to Q&A from the audience, are there any other thoughts from Amelie, Luke, or Owen about the drivers of these farmer protests and what we can be doing to help to prevent them in the first place, right?
Yeah, I think I'd just add a comment that, in the EU context, it's not the first time we've seen farmer protests, right? I mean, they used to be quite commonplace. They come and go. They're quite often due to particular grievances that might have occurred on certain regulations or prices. Prices go up and down. That can create tensions. So I think they're, yes, they're important, but they have been something that have featured before, and we've got through that, and we've got to a sort of better solution on the other side. I think probably economics is driving a lot of this. We've seen a huge amount of disruption, inflation, uncertainty in the food sector. It's affected everybody in different ways. So consumers are obviously seeing higher prices in many circumstances. Manufacturers have faced a squeeze, so have retailers, and of course farmers have been impacted as well. So that's going to create a reaction, and I think we need to recognize that and create a better consensus moving forwards.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I agree. Thank you. All right, I'm going to stop us there and now move over to the Q&A. Again, there's been a rich chat in the Q&A. We've pulled out sort of 5 questions that we're going to try to race through in the last 15 minutes of this webinar. So question 1 is to everyone, although perhaps Amelie, Owen, and Luke a little bit more to you, although Melinda, actually, I'm curious what you think too. So for net zero transition, should we move away from solutions focusing on efficiency gains dependent on current production systems and prioritize more of a paradigm shift towards more regenerative systems? What do we think?
The short answer from my point of view is yes. We just have to be very careful how we frame all of this, because often it sounds like a North imposed new paradigm to the South, saying basically we've improved our way of producing, we've produced enough for our population, but now the environment is at threat, and therefore you guys should not do the same. And and a lot of the Southern world is saying, well, who are you to tell us that? We also want an economic development, and we don't see why we couldn't have the same one. But I think what we need to understand is actually that when I think when you were presenting, you were talking about the fact that we produce that much amount of food, yet there is 700 million people who are still hungry, and therefore we need to produce more. Actually, a third of all of that is wasted. And a lot of people are eating the wrong things, too many calories of the wrong things, while others are starving. So actually, it's really not about needing to produce more. There are questions of food sovereignty and food security that are really important to solve for a number of countries, and especially in these very difficult geopolitical times, everybody's starting to think, I need to produce my own food. So that raises a number of concerns. But overall, it's really about finding ways to produce in a way that is regenerative, and that, by the way, will help us be resilient to climate change. Because actually, I like to revert the question. I remember a long time ago, one of my colleagues asked, can we afford to all eat from sustainable agriculture? And my answer is actually, we cannot afford not to. Because if we do not do that shift, we continue to erode our soil, we continue to destroy the rest of what we have, run increasingly out of water, and therefore we're just not going to be able to feed ourselves. So really, we need to do that shift and understand that it's in the interest of everyone, provided that we do the right share of value across people who really need it the most.
I like that. Luke, Owen, do you guys agree? Melindy's shaking his head, so I'm like, he's agreeing with this.
I think a good point that Emily brought up is just around when we talk about efficiency. Much of what we've been talking about on this webinar and what we talk about in the report is what happens on the farm. But if you look at the system as a whole, there's huge efficiency gains that we can have midstream and downstream by eliminating food waste and loss. And so we can gain great efficiencies there without having to get into the discussion about efficiencies on farm. Certainly there's going to be some trade-offs. I think we need to maximize those regenerative approaches where we don't have huge efficiency losses. But I totally agree with what Emily said. There's other areas where we can bring efficiency into the system and feed a growing population. We're producing more than enough food to do it already. It's about getting it to the right places and making sure that we're not losing it along the way.
Like it. So a yes and yes. Those are always my answers to questions. Do we need to do the things? Yes, and we need to do all the things in order to get to where we need to go. Okay, next question, Melindy, for you, and maybe Owen, I'll come to you for the same question next. Do we need to think more radically about sharing risk and reward in supply chains to facilitate flows of capital? Or do we have what we need already and we just need to scale our existing solutions?
Yeah, I like this question. So I don't know who asked it, but I really like it because that's how we have to think about the supply chain, and we have to think about it in its entirety, not think too much on one side and then sort of like try and get an output from another side. So I think it's definitely important to think about how is risk and reward shared across, and then also thinking about how to implement this. So in a lot of the work that we do as One Acre Fund, for example, even here in Rwanda, working with smallholder supply chains is basically us taking a bet on the smallholders produce and then linking this with markets. And we end up doing a lot of the work in training the farmers on quality management and also doing a lot of the logistics and working with the farmers on the logistics of getting the produce to market. And I would go as far as saying for a number of these supply chains, if we were not involved, it would be very difficult for these farmers to access the markets that they're accessing now. So I think just from our own experience and what I've seen is we need someone to be able to bet on these farmers and say, yes, we believe these farmers can achieve this level of quality, this level of production, and we're willing to invest this amount to make sure it happens. And then, of course, thinking of how to make it easier for the market as well. So then somebody comes there in between and make sure that you're sort of thinking about both ends of the market. So I would say we need to think a bit more radically about how risk is flowing in the supply chain. And there are some existing solutions, but of course, like you said, Morgan, it's yes and yes. You need to always also think about scaling existing solutions, but also bringing additional solutions to this problem, making it comfortable for the market, but then also making sure that the farmer is not penalized for things that they weren't doing already, but walking that journey with them. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And Owen, I mean, that's the perspective effectively of the smallholder farmer. What is the perspective of the big business? You know, do you agree that we need to really radically rethink how we share both the risk and the profitability across supply chains? Or are we good? We just need to scale, scale, scale.
Well, we do need to scale. I think we need more investment from more actors in the supply chain. And as I said before, I think that the first step to that is just for all companies to recognize there is a cost involved in the transition to allocate sufficient resources to that transition. And that just hasn't been done yet. I mean, even some basic things like really recognizing Scope 3 emissions and publishing commitments to address them have also not been done, right, by all companies. So there's some sort of groundwork that still needs to happen to enable a scale up of financial flows. That will help. There's also a need to rethink the way it works at the farm level. Just to give you a quick example, our coffee business, Nespresso, has been piloting some micro insurance products for coffee farmers to protect them against harvests if those harvests fail or they do not perform as expected due to the impacts of climate change, right? So that's an insurance product. You know, we're not an insurance company again, but we're kind of looking at that as an innovative solution to say, that's how we can cover the gap. And that kind of approach could cover the gap. For example, if you implement a regen ag approach, which results in a short-term yield impact, is there a way of ensuring that or providing a stability of income through that transition period, which gives more confidence to the farmer? And if we can show that that works, then we share that across the industry, and then we get that scale of and through innovation that we perhaps need to get to the next stage.
That makes sense to me. Luke, coming to you next, and this is a great question again from our very active audience. Do you envision the implementation of market-based instruments to give companies credit as projects are implemented?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it goes back to some of the challenges I was talking about with the current system, which is one, the supply base is very dynamic. So companies are buying from one farmer this year and then another farmer next year. But what we need is for those investments to go on individual farms. We also face challenges with traceability. We have common pool aggregation points. And so soy comes into a silo from 15, 20 different farms in a supply shed, and you can't necessarily trace that individual soybean that you sourced back to that farm. And so that creates challenges for companies. The reality is that companies need to show progress towards their targets. And I think a very real reality is how some of these investments evolve within companies is the ag team will come up with an investment that they can make to support the transition for a farmer to implement cover crops. And then it goes down to the data and accounting team, and the data and accounting team says, hey, we don't know if we can reflect this in our accounting system to count towards our target. And then that investment starts getting held back. And I just think with the reality of how the current system works, you have to allow for some sort of mass balance or booking claim systems to get these investments mobilized faster and quicker. There's initiatives out there that are really working on this right now, like the Value Change Initiative, putting really robust accounting systems. So there is accountability, making sure that there's no double counting in the system. And it actually brings better and more granular data to what the companies are doing. So I think it's certainly part of the solution, and it's just a reality that reflects how international food supply chains work right now that we have to find a solution there.
I feel like we could have an entire webinar on the topic of market-based instruments and the incentive structures that they drive. But I'm, again, conscious of time. And Melinda, I want to come to you. We have a few more questions I kind of want to race to get through. Farm equipment today is designed for large farms and monoculture. Are there appropriate investments being made to develop farm equipment that support with implementing regen ag and reduce labor requirements?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something that we're also working on, because as we start thinking of conservation agriculture practices, regenerative agriculture in general, we have to think of the labor. Labor is quite costly, and farmers who are used to one particular practice, moving them to another one of the feedbacks that they give you is usually that this is so labor intensive and consuming. How am I going to do this? So definitely, I would say we do have technology that is out there, and we see it as well. But I would just go as far as saying that finding it, especially in the regions that we operate in, at an affordable cost for the farmers is where the challenge is. So we have to start thinking about, okay, how do we, the technology is there, it's being developed in a country that's a bit far away. How can we develop that technology locally and build those equipment in country to make it more affordable for the farmers that we're working with, or even for what we can call micro level entrepreneurs who want to move around the farms, providing this service. So I think that cost factor is something that we also need to consider here, because otherwise, for the conventional practices, we do have the equipment, but for those regen practices, we do have challenges, especially when we're thinking about polyculture, meaning multiple crops in a field. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks for that. I have a bit of a wild card question, and then we'll finish with a question kind of focusing back on the businesses. That was kind of the purpose of our webinar today. And I love this question. So we have a VC investor apparently joining us today. So the question is, as a VC investor, venture capital investor focused on technology enabling sustainable agriculture, how can we link with other forms of financing to make early stage tech like fertilizer alternatives or direct seeders more available to farmers globally? Anyone want to venture to take that one? Owen?
I can offer an opinion, which is that I think we need to see a bit of a shift in the approach from the major players in that market. So to embrace more new technologies such as fertilizer alternatives, I think I'd like to see a little bit more innovation, a little bit more risk taking from the current big players, and I think VCs could, maybe appeal to their more progressive and innovation R&D tendencies to try and make that go to scale.
Any other thoughts, guys?
No, just to say, as mentioned before, we really need to scale up the investment we're making in identifying financial solutions. So we need to become much more innovative, as Owen was saying, and we're starting to have quite a lot of discussions, I think, amongst different groups here on how we can piggyback on existing or develop new public or private financial resources. And that's really the area where we need to be the most efficient, I would say, and to come up with the most solutions the most urgently in the future. So very open to having a follow-up discussion on how we can help really identify new solutions and really scale up the ones that are already existing.
Perfect. And an easy
Maybe
question
I just
for, oh, no, go on, jump
Morgan,
in.
I just want to try on that one specifically because the feeders are needed. The alternative to fertilizer is needed.
Mm.
I'm talking about at the farmer level. So now the disconnect is probably happening on maybe on financing. But I think the other thing to consider here is a lot of these other solutions, especially on the fertilizer front, are subsidized by different governments. So I think also thinking about how do you overcome that piece, it would be really helpful because at the farmer level, we need such types of solutions. But if there's an alternative which is subsidized, that is the synthetic fertilizer, it's going to be very difficult for the farmer to move to this other product. So I think also thinking at the policy national level, how do you engage with governments on these sort of alternative products is something that you need to think about.
That's an excellent point. Okay, we have 3 minutes left. So this is rapid fire, 45-second responses from each of you. And I kind of feel like I know what you're going to say, but hopefully this summarizes the conversation. How could the risks and the means for the transition be included in business models, sourcing models, and core businesses across all actors in the value chain? So how could this be included? Ameline's nodding, so I'm going to go to her first, and then we'll come to all of you.
I love this question because actually in WBCSD, one of the biggest things we're focusing on is what we call corporate performance and accountability systems. We believe that if we're able to support the companies in developing the right metrics in order to measure and understand better their risks and also the opportunities, then this will actually allow to mobilize different actions outside of the companies, which is, again, the financiers and getting the better investments, but also within the companies. It's going to help really shift the investment that are made to research and development and innovation, as well as procurement. So really corporate performance and accountability systems, metrics, accountability is the key word for us, and it can really help unlock the situation in which we are.
Right there. Owen.
Yeah, so very simply, I would say just recognize that there's an investment required, embrace that, then look at ways of implementing it in a way that helps your business and unlocks some of the opportunities that we saw also flagged up in a report that was published. So it's not just a cash out, it's also a resilience question. It's about improving your supply chain, it's improving your ways of working, exploring new markets. So kind of look at both the cost and the opportunity at the same time. Thanks.
Luke.
Yeah, thanks. I'll keep it short, high level, and philosophical, but I think it's accelerating that transition to the post-commodity era and starting to place value not just on what comes off of the farm, but what happens on the farm.
Thank you for that. And Melindy.
Yeah, I would just say that, and it's almost saying what everybody's saying, but it's just thinking about it in terms of this is what enables sustainability. So it doesn't matter if you can put it like on a line item in your budgets or something like that on the accounting level, but if we don't do this, we'll not be able to produce in the future. So just sort of thinking about it in those sort of terms.
Simple as that. Well, folks, we are 1 minute away from ending this webinar, and I wanted to thank all of our speakers for their contributions, as well as the audience members for participating. I can't believe how many questions and answers are in that Q&A box. So Owen, Ameline, Melindy, and Luke, thank you so much. Alex, huge congratulations for the report. We dropped in the chat box. If folks do have more questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to the FOLU team. You can reach us at info@folu.org. And if you haven't read the Future Fit reports, please do so now. The link is in the chat box. We like these to be action orientated. So go away, dream big, be inspired, and take action. Please go away and do one thing that helps to help this movement move forward, because we need all players acting together to build the sustainable, resilient, nutritious, and affordable future that we all know we can have. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day. Go forth.
Thank you as well, Morgan, Clara, and the FOLU team.
guys.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Bye.